Hi everybody, this is your narrator Ali, and I hope you are ready to relax to our story today. Find a quiet place, let your shoulders soften, and allow the day to fall away. Tonight we are traveling to an old kingdom of forests and stone halls, where a queen longs for a child, where roses carry enchantment, and where a bride must face a serpent prince with more courage than anyone around her. Chapter 1. Roses in the Northwest Corner. There was once a young king and his queen who lived in a fine stone castle above a river. The kingdom was peaceful, the fields were fruitful, and the people loved their rulers. Only one sorrow sat in the royal house, and it grew heavier with each passing year. The king and queen had no child. The queen would watch the village women walk past with babies at their breasts and little ones clinging to their skirts. She would see the small hands reaching, the quick bright eyes looking up with trust, and a deep ache would stir in her heart. The king, though he spoke of matters of state and trade and war, felt a different ache. He had no heir to one day bear the crown. One gray afternoon, when the air smelled of coming rain and the castle felt close and heavy, the queen went walking alone in the gardens. Her steps took her beyond the clipped hedges and rose arches, past the ordered beds of herbs, to the furthest corner where the grass grew a little wild and moss climbed the stones. There, in the shadow of an old wall, she met an ugly old woman. The woman stood leaning on a crooked stick, her cloak patched, her face lined like dried fruit. She had that look about her which made people whisper, "Witch," when she passed, but there was no sharpness in her eyes, only a keen, thoughtful kindness. She peered at the queen. "Why does such a fair lady wear such a sorrowful face?" she asked, her voice as dry as fallen leaves. The queen hesitated. What help could this stranger offer? Yet something in the woman's tone loosened her tongue. "It is a grief no one can mend," she said. "The king and I have no child. That is all." "Is that all?" the old woman answered softly. "Then your sorrow is not as hopeless as you think. Such things can be set right, if you are willing to follow a small piece of counsel." The queen studied her. "What counsel could you possibly give?" she said, though more gently than before. "Listen," the old woman replied. "Tonight, when the sun is sinking and the garden is quiet, take a little drinking cup, the kind with 2 ears for handles. Turn it upside down on the ground in the northwest corner of your garden and leave it there. At sunrise tomorrow, lift the cup. Beneath it, you will find 2 roses, one red and one white. If you eat the red rose, a son will be born to you. If you eat the white, you will bear a daughter. But mark this well, eat only one. If you take both, you will live to regret it." Hope flared inside the queen like a sudden lamp. She drew off a gold ring in gratitude, but the old woman closed her gnarled fingers and shook her head. "Keep your ring," she said. "You may have more use for it later. Remember only what I have told you." Then, as quietly as mist fading in sunlight, she turned and went away between the trees. That evening, the queen did exactly as she had been told. When the sun slid down behind the hills and the sky glowed with the last embers of day, she took a small silver cup with 2 delicate handles and set it upside down on the soil in the northwest corner of the garden. She did not tell the king what she had done. Some hopes are too fragile to speak aloud. The night seemed very long, but at last the first pale thread of dawn appeared. She rose before anyone else in the castle, wrapped a cloak over her shoulders, and went down the dew-damp paths to that far corner. Her hands trembled as she lifted the little cup. There, just as the old woman had promised, lay 2 roses pressed to the earth, one red as spilled wine, the other white as new milk. The sight took her breath. She knelt and stared, happiness and confusion wrestling within her. "If I choose the red," she thought, "and heaven sends us a son, he may grow into a brave man and go to war. The wars take many sons and give back few. If I choose the white and have a daughter, she will warm our house with laughter, but one day she will marry, ride away with her husband, and leave us alone again. Either way, we may still end our days with empty hands." She sat there a long while, weighed down by choice. At last she reached for the white rose. "A daughter," she whispered. "Let me at least hold her for some years before she must leave." She bit the petals and found them surprisingly sweet, with a cool fragrance that filled her mouth and mind. The taste pleased her so much that without thinking further, without recalling the witch's warning, she plucked up the red rose and ate it as well. Only after both stems lay empty at her feet did a cold thought run through her. "The old woman told me, not both." But it was done. The petals had dissolved upon her tongue. There was no returning them to the stalk. She walked back to the castle under a sky that seemed to hold both promise and shadow. Chapter 2. Twins and a Forgotten. Warning time passed, as it always does, and news soon spread through the palace that the queen would at last bear a child. The king's joy knew no bounds. He ordered bells to be rung, alms to be given to the poor, candles to be lit in every chapel. The kingdom rejoiced with him. Before the child was born, the king was called away to lead his troops to war. One dark morning he rode out with his men, banners streaming, armor shining, looking back again and again at the queen as she stood on the steps, one hand raised in farewell, the other laid protectively on her swelling belly. "Guard them both," he prayed silently, "the kingdom and the little life yet unseen." While he was away, the queen's time came. In the hush of a winter night, the chambers above the great hall filled with the urgent sounds of birth. Servants scurried, midwives whispered, fires burned hot. At last a cry rang out, not the cry of the queen, but the first high voice of new life. The queen sank back on her pillows, exhausted yet radiant, as the midwife placed in her arms a beautiful baby boy. His hair was dark gold, his skin pale and clear, his small hands curling around air. He was strong and perfect, and the queen's heart ached with love. But even as she gazed at him, a strange movement at the edge of the room caught her eye. There, writhing where the shadows met the stone, something long and pale and sinuous slid across the floor. It was shaped like a serpent, but larger and strangely formed, with faint hints of limbs hidden beneath shining scales. Its eyes gleamed with a cold intelligence. Before anyone else turned their head, the creature glided swiftly toward the window, slipped through a crack in the shutters, and vanished into the night. The queen's blood ran cold. She opened her mouth to cry out, then stopped. The midwife was speaking, the attendants chattering softly, all of them looking at the child in her arms. Had no one else seen? Their faces were full of normal joy and relief. Only a trick of pain and tired eyes, she told herself. A dream born of fear. Yet deep in her heart she remembered the 2 roses and the old woman's warning not to eat both. She said nothing. She pressed the warm baby boy to her breast and clung to him as to a promise. When the king returned from war and looked upon his son, his delight was complete. The child grew strong and straight, a prince in whom hope rested easily. The strange vision of the serpent child sank slowly beneath the surface of the queen's thoughts, though it never truly left her. Years slipped by. The prince grew from toddling child to laughing boy, from boy to young man. He learned the arts of war and peace, of hunting and music, of courtly speech and quiet reflection. His parents watched him with pride, and the kingdom waited for the day when he would take a bride and secure the line of kings. No one spoke of rose magic or lindworms. The queen carried that secret alone. Chapter 3. The Lindworm at the Crossroads. At last the time came when the prince must seek a bride. The king ordered the royal coach harnessed, the great gilded carriage drawn by 6 white horses whose harness rang with silver, and bade his son ride forth to visit neighboring kingdoms and find a princess worthy of his rank. The prince set out in high spirits. The countryside rolled past, fields, forests, villages with smoke rising straight into the morning air. As they drove, he imagined the faces of the princesses he might meet, wondered about their voices, their minds, their hearts. They reached the first crossroads where the road divided, one way leading toward the mountains, another to the sea. There, in the very center where the tracks crossed, something vast and pale blocked their way. It was a lindworm, a serpent large as a fallen tree, coiled with its head lifted, mouth gaping wide. Its scales gleamed faintly, and its eyes shone with a disturbing awareness. The horses reared and snorted. The coachman pulled hard on the reins. From that yawning mouth came a voice, thick and commanding. "A bride for me," it cried, "before a bride for you." The prince felt the blood drain from his face. There was something dreadfully familiar in the shape of that monstrous head, something which stirred the oldest memories of his mother's eyes. Yet a serpent stood before him, and it barred his way. "Turn back," he said quietly. "Take the other road." They turned the carriage and tried the left-hand path. For a while the journey was smooth, and the prince began to think the obstacle behind them. But at the very next crossing of ways, there it lay again, the same lindworm stretched from ditch to ditch, jaws open, repeating in that eerie voice, "A bride for me before a bride for you." There was no getting past. The coachman dared not risk the horses, and the prince felt, without knowing why, that to defy this creature was to invite disaster. Silently, he ordered the carriage turned back toward the castle. The king was astonished to see his son return so soon, his face troubled. When the prince told what had happened, the queen felt as though the air had fled the room. The serpent child she had seen on the night of the birth, the eaten roses, the witch's warning, everything aligned in her mind. With a heavy heart, she confessed to the king that their son was not, in truth, an only child, that he had been born twin to a lindworm, who must by right be considered the elder. The king's face grew grim. "If this is so," he said slowly, "then the creature claims precedence. If our younger son is to marry, we must first find a bride for his elder brother, however strange that brother may be." And so the search for a bride took a darker turn. Chapter 4. 2 princesses devoured the king, wrote letters sealed with gold and wax to distant courts, sending messengers with promises of rich alliance. He asked for a princess to wed his son, but he did not say which son, nor mention the scaled form that waited at the crossroads. At length, from a neighboring realm, an answer came. A princess would be sent, a royal bride to bind their kingdoms in friendship. She arrived with a train of ladies, servants, and guards, her carriage draped with embroidered cloth. She was young, proud, and finely dressed, with eyes that glittered at the side of the foreign castle, rising above the plain. She had never been told anything unusual about the match. She pictured a handsome prince, a shining hall, and a future full of honor. Customs of that time forbade the bride from seeing her groom before the ceremony. So she was led straight to the bridal chamber to be adorned, jewels placed upon her, hair braided, gown laid upon her shoulders, the hall filled with guests and music. At last the bridegroom entered and stood beside her. Instead of a man in velvet and silver, a vast, pale serpent slid forward, raising its head to her height, its eyes fixed on her, and its mouth parted in what might have been a smile had it not shown so many teeth. A shudder ran through the guests, yet no one dared cry out. The marriage rite proceeded, and before the princess could protest, the words were spoken that bound her to the Lindworm prince. That night she was led, shaking, into the wedding chamber. In the morning she was gone. The servants who crept to the door and peered in found only the Lindworm there, coiled and sleeping, his sides round and full. The truth was whispered from mouth to mouth. He had devoured her. The young prince, hearing of this, waited a while, then came again to his father. "Now that my brother has taken a wife," he said, "may I not once more go journeying to seek mine?" The king hesitated, then consented, hoping against hope that the Lindworm would be satisfied. But when the prince's coach again reached the first crossroads, the Lindworm lay where he had lain before, his jaws wide, his voice booming. "A bride for me before a bride for you." The second road brought the same thing. Once more the prince turned back. Once more letters were written, this time to a more distant kingdom. After many delays, another princess arrived, this one from across seas and mountains. She too was wedded without seeing her husband, and she too vanished before the next dawn, leaving the Lindworm alone and sleeping. The murmur of scandal began to run through neighboring courts. Kings whose daughters had been sent began to harbor anger and suspicion. Rumors swirled like crows. The young prince, however, still wished to wed and to secure his future. He came a third time before his father. "Once more I went out," he said, "and once more my brother blocked the way. If ever I am to marry, he must be given a bride again." The king spread his hands helplessly. "Where shall I find a third princess?" he said. "Two kings already hold me responsible for their daughter's fate. No royal lady will dare come while the story of the Lindworm spreads like smoke. I am at an end of options." But the law of the elder brother's right stood before them like a wall. Chapter 5. The Shepherd's Daughter and the Wise Woman. Near the great forest that bordered the kingdom, there lived an old shepherd in a low cottage with his only child, a daughter. They kept a small flock and lived simply, content with bread from their oven, milk from their cow, and the music of the sheep bells drifting in the evening. One day the king himself rode out with a few companions and came to the shepherd's door. "Good man," he said, "I am in need of a bride for my eldest son. Will you give me your daughter to be his wife? In return, I will see that you lack for nothing all your days. Your cottage shall be repaired, your flock increased, your table well supplied." The shepherd stared, stunned. He knew of the disappearances at the castle. He had heard whispers of the serpent prince and the princesses who had vanished. "Sire," he answered respectfully, "I have only this one daughter. She is my comfort in old age. When my bones are stiff, she will fetch the water and tend the fire. If she goes to your son, she will not return. Did he spare those two high-born maidens? He is not likely to spare my child. She is too good a girl to be swallowed by such a fate." The king's face hardened. The crown sits heavy on any man's head, and sometimes it presses mercy thin. "I cannot ask elsewhere," he said. "I have offered you great reward. If you refuse, do you think you can hide your daughter from a king?" The shepherd's shoulders sagged. He loved his child more than his own life, but he knew the iron weight of royal will. In the end, with tears in his eyes, he bowed his head. The girl was heartbroken when her father told her she must be given to Prince Lindworm. She had seen the smoke of the castle from her door and dreamed, as many village girls do, of splendid halls. But not like this, not as food for a serpent groom. Unable to bear the close walls of the cottage, she fled into the forest, running blindly between the trees, her hands pressed to her face. She wept, not only for herself, but for the father she must leave alone, and for the dreadful way her life seemed about to end. At last, she sank down by a hollow oak and sobbed until her tears ran dry. As she sat there in despair, a voice spoke from behind her. "What do you mourn so bitterly, pretty lass?" She looked up, startled. From the hollow trunk stepped an old woman with sharp eyes and a face furrowed by years. Her cloak was patched and moss-green, her gray hair bound in a coil. There was something of the forest in her, as if she had grown there with the oaks. "It is useless to tell you," the girl said dully. "No one in the world can help me." "You never know," the old woman replied. "Tell me your trouble. Paths that seem to end in darkness sometimes turn, if you look closely." So the girl poured out her heart. She told of the Lindworm prince, of the devoured princesses, of the king's demand and her father's sorrow. "I am to marry the serpent," she finished. "He will swallow me as he has swallowed the others. How can I not be distressed?" The old woman listened gravely, nodding now and then. When the tale was done, she said, "Your danger is real, but it is not without remedy. If you will do exactly as I tell you, you may save not only yourself, but the prince who languishes beneath that serpent's skin." Hope flickered in the girl's eyes, though fear still shadowed them. "Tell me what to do," she said. "On the night of your wedding," the wise woman instructed, "when the feast is over and you are to go with your husband to your chamber, ask to be dressed in 10 snow-white shifts, one over another. Then ask that they bring to your room a tub full of strong lye water, another tub full of fresh milk, and as many rods and whips as a boy can carry in his arms. Let no one persuade you to lessen that number. When all are in place and the door is shut behind you, the Lindworm will tell you to shed a shift. You must answer him thus: 'Prince Lindworm, do you cast off a skin?' Every time he bids you undress, you must bid him to slough one of his own skins. When he has cast off all he wears and lies before you as nothing more than a raw, quivering form, then dip the whips in the lye and strike him with all your strength. After that, wash him with the fresh milk until every mark is soothed. Finally," and here the old woman's voice grew very soft, "finally, you must take him in your arms and hold him, if only for a moment. Only then will the old curse be broken." The shepherd's daughter shuddered. "To hold that creature," she whispered, "cold and slimy and trembling, this seems the hardest thing of all." "The hardest things are often the last step to freedom," said the wise woman. "Do all as I have told you, and you will not regret your courage." Before the girl could ask more, the old woman stepped back into the hollow oak and was gone, leaving the forest quiet once more. Chapter 6. 10 Shifts and a Serpent Groom. The day of the wedding came. The king's chariot, drawn by 6 white horses, rolled up to the shepherd's cottage. The girl hugged her father long and hard. He could scarcely speak, his throat tight with unshed tears. At last they parted, and she climbed into the carriage, her eyes dry, but her heart pounding. At the castle, servants met her, astonished at her simple dress and quiet bearing. They took her to the chamber where brides were prepared, and there they laid out splendid garments, jewels that caught the light like fire and water, veils of silk. Before they began to dress her, she spoke calmly. "I will wear your fine things," she said, "but first bring me 10 shifts of plain white linen, as white as new snow, and have a tub filled with strong lye brought to my room, and another filled with fresh sweet milk from the morning's milking. Also, send a boy to fetch as many rods and whips as he can carry in his arms." The ladies of the court raised their eyebrows and murmured to one another. "What peasant superstition is this?" they whispered. "What nonsense has she brought from her cottage?" But when the request was repeated to the king, he, remembering perhaps an old tale or feeling some unease in his heart, said, "Let her have whatever she requires. We have denied no princess. We shall not deny her." So the 10 white shifts were brought, stacked like folded clouds. The tubs were filled and placed in the bridal chamber, one steaming with scented lye, the other glowing with cream-topped milk. A boy staggered in under the weight of whips, bundled in his arms. The shepherd's daughter was then dressed in the royal gown, the finest the castle could provide. She stood still as the ladies braided her hair, set a circlet upon her head, and fastened pearls at her throat. When they were done, she looked like any king's daughter, though there was an extra steadiness in her eyes that came not from silk or jewels. The great hall was hung with banners, torches flashed in iron brackets. The guests gathered, the musicians played, and the long tables groaned with food. The bride was led in, and she took her place before the altar of marriage. Then, with a sound like something heavy gliding over stone, the bridegroom came. Prince Lindworm entered the hall, vast and pale, his scaled body coiling and uncoiling as he moved. His head rose to the height of a man's shoulders, his eyes glinting like gems buried deep underground. Many guests turned away with a shudder. Some clutched charms beneath their clothes, but the shepherd's daughter stood still, her hands clasped before her, her face calm. The ceremony was spoken. She gave her responses in a clear voice. When the rites were finished, she and the Lindworm prince were declared husband and wife. A feast followed, as was proper. Dishes were brought and taken away, cups filled and refilled, songs sung. Yet a hush lay beneath the merriment, a sense that all were watching a story whose end they could not guess. At last it was time for the bridal couple to withdraw. With pipes and drums, torches, and bowed heads, the procession led them to their chamber door. The door shut behind them. The shepherd's daughter looked around. There stood the tubs, just as she had ordered, and beside them the bundle of whips. Along a chair lay the 10 white shifts. The Lindworm raised his head, and his voice filled the room. "Fair maiden," he said, "cast off a shift." Her heart leapt against her ribs, but she drew a breath and answered as she had been instructed. "Prince Lindworm," she replied, "cast off a skin." He hissed softly, surprised. "No one has ever spoken those words to me," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Then it is time someone did," she told him, her voice firm. "Cast off a skin." He writhed and groaned, the room filled with a rasp of scales against floor. At last, with a heavy, sickly sound, a long, empty skin sagged onto the stones. She pulled off her first white shift and laid it carefully over the discarded skin, covering it completely. The Lindworm spoke again. "Fair maiden, cast off a shift." "Prince Lindworm, cast off a skin," she answered, unwavering. Again he protested that no one had ever dared command him so. Again she insisted. He groaned louder this time, twisting upon himself, and a second skin sloughed to the floor. She removed her second shift and spread it over the new husk. So it went on, again and again. Cast off a shift. Cast off a skin. With each command the Lindworm grew more furious, his little eyes rolling, his body heaving. With each shed skin he grew smaller, but more raw, more terrible to see. The white shifts covered each layer of discarded serpent flesh until the floor was piled with them. 9 times they repeated the ancient dance of words. 9 skins lay hidden beneath 9 linen shrouds. At last there was nothing left, coiled before her, but a thick, shapeless mass, glistening and trembling, hardly more than formless flesh. Everything in her wanted to recoil, to flee, but she remembered the wise woman's words. She seized the bundle of whips, plunged them into the steaming tub of lye, and then struck the raw creature with all the strength in her arms. He shrieked and writhed, but she did not stop. She lashed him until the last remnant of the old enchantment loosened and ran away with the lye. Then she threw aside the rods, scooped up clean cloths, and dipped them into the tub of fresh milk. Gently now she bathed the bruised and burning flesh, washing away the sting. The milk steamed a little where it touched him, and slowly, slowly his trembling eased. Finally came the hardest task. She dragged the heavy, sapped form up onto the bed. Her whole body shook with effort and revulsion. Yet she climbed in beside him, wrapped her arms around a rough, unknown shape, and held him, her cheek resting on whatever part seemed least strange. The moment she did so, exhaustion swept over her like a wave. She closed her eyes and fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 7. A Prince Restored and a Wedding Renewed. Dawn crept over the castle, painting the sky with pale colors. In the corridors outside the bridal chamber, there was a hush punctuated by whispers. The king, the queen, and a handful of courtiers had gathered, unable to bear their uncertainty any longer. They clustered around the door like children around a forbidden chest. "Look through the keyhole," one courtier whispered to another. "No, you do it," the other whispered back. At last the king himself bent and peered through the narrow opening. What he saw made him start and pull back. "There is no Lindworm," he murmured, voice shaking. "There is a girl on the bed, and beside her lies, I can hardly believe it, a young man, handsome as the day is long." The queen pushed forward and took her own look, then clasped her hands to her mouth. "I know that face," she whispered. "It is the face our son might have had he been born free." They opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The shepherd's daughter lay sleeping, her face relaxed and lovely, her hair spread over the pillow. Beside her, under the coverlets, lay a prince where the serpent had been. His skin was fair, his features fine, his hair falling in waves upon the linen. The white shifts and old skins had vanished as though they had never existed. Only a faint scent of milk lingered in the air. The king and queen sank to their knees by the bed, overcome with joy and awe. They dared not wake the sleepers, but their hearts sang. Word flew through the castle like birds released from a cage. By the time the sun climbed high, the halls were thronging with people. Musicians tuned their instruments, cooks rushed to and fro, laughter and exclamation echoed against the stone. When the prince and the shepherd's daughter finally awoke, they found themselves surrounded by smiling faces and streaming banners. Their first marriage had been shadowed by fear and enchantment. Now the king declared that the wedding should be held again in full light and gladness. This time there was no secrecy. The guests saw the bride and groom together, a peasant maid in borrowed silk, and a prince whose eyes held the depth of one who had known darkness and come through it. The feast that followed outshone all that had gone before. For days the castle was filled with music, dancing, and generous tables. The poor of the kingdom were fed from the royal kitchens. Wine flowed, and stories were told at every hearth. As for the shepherd's daughter, she was no longer called thus. She became the king's daughter in truth, though she never forgot the forest path or the hollow oak where an old woman had given her counsel. The king and queen loved her dearly, not only for saving their son, but for the quiet wisdom and gentleness she brought into their home. She had faced what others feared and had not turned back. By her steadiness, her obedience to good advice, and her uncommon bravery, she had transformed a curse into a blessing. Prince Lindworm, restored to human form, grew into a ruler who understood both the weight of guilt and the sweetness of mercy. He did not forget the skins he had shed, nor the two princesses whose lives had been taken before he was freed. He ruled with a careful justice, and under his hand the kingdom flourished. And the younger prince, at last, was free to seek his own bride, though that is another tale. Closing reflection: shedding skins. Our story of Prince Lindworm leaves us with images that linger: roses hidden beneath a cup, a serpent blocking a road, 10 white shifts laid over empty skins, a girl standing her ground before a monstrous groom. In one sense, it is a fairy tale about curses and enchantments, witches and kings. But in another, quieter sense, it is about the many skins we wear and the courage it takes to shed them. The queen's small act of forgetting, eating both roses, brought consequences she could not foresee. So it is with many of our choices. They seem sweet in the moment, and only later do we see which seeds they planted. Yet the story does not end with her mistake. It continues until someone brave enough and humble enough appears to put things right. The shepherd's daughter is that someone. She is not rich nor born to a throne, yet she listens carefully when wisdom speaks, even if it comes from an old woman in a hollow tree. She does not refuse the hard tasks: to command the serpent, to wield the whips, to wash what is wounded, and finally to embrace what is frightening and unknown. Perhaps each of us carries a Lindworm somewhere inside, a part of ourselves bound up in old fears, habits, or shame. Such parts rarely change just because we wish them to. Like the prince, they must be faced, layer by layer, with truth that does not flinch and kindness that does not run away. To strike what is false, to soothe what is sore, and then to hold what remains, this is work of transformation. It is not always beautiful while it is happening, but it leads, as the tale shows, to a new face in the morning light. As you drift toward sleep or back into your day, you might ask yourself gently, what skin am I being asked to shed? Where is courage calling me to stand firm like the shepherd's daughter, even when everything in me wants to turn aside? Thank you for traveling with me through this story. This is your narrator, Ali, wishing you steadiness in your own journeys, wise voices when you most need them, and the grace to become, like Prince Lindworm, more fully yourself with each skin you leave behind. For more stories that can help you relax, don't forget to like and subscribe.